Hi. Hello. Good to see you again, or see you for the first time. This is Sara, or Sauce. I promise Nora exists, but I've just been taking over the channel just because I read more than her. So that's just how it is. You will see her. She's not the Loch Ness monster. She exists. So, but anyways, today I'm going to show my top 10 favorite books of 2024. It took me a while to do this because one, I had to figure out what was my top 10, and two, just remembering everything. I had to go back through some books because I read them in the beginning of the year. So, yeah, this is my top 10 favorites of 2024. Now, disclaimer, I just want to put a disclaimer. I'm a regular girl who reads a lot of books that can be challenging for me, or I've never learned before. So I'm not like an expert, I'm not like a scholar or an academic that I know a lot of these subjects very well. I just love to learn, and these are my opinions, and this is just my reading journey and my learning journey. So, yeah. So, for 2024 in general, I read mostly nonfiction. Nonfiction has just been my favorite type of book last year. So, a lot of these books, almost all of them, are nonfiction except for one. One book is fiction, and the rest are nonfiction. And I tend to have a hard time putting against each other fiction versus nonfiction, just because I tend to gravitate more towards nonfiction. So it doesn't mean that the fiction I read is not good. It just means that I tend to lean more towards nonfiction, because I don't know, I learn a lot from nonfiction. And if I learn something that really interests me, I really like that book. So I tend to put nonfiction up higher than fiction. And I think all the years previously, like, my favorite books were nonfiction books. So I guess that's just how I am as a reader. So that's just gonna give you like an idea of why my favorites are like that, and how it's very particular to me and the way I read. So I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up. So start at 10 and work my way up. I did that because I like drama. So in 10th place, we have The Barn, The Secret History of a Murder in Mississippi by Wright Thompson. This book is about Emmett Till's murder. So if you don't know who Emmett Till is, I knew who Emmett Till was, but I didn't know, sadly, the details of Emmett Till, and I didn't even know he was. I just didn't know when it happened, how old he was, all these like things. So for those of you who don't know about Emmett Till or his murder, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy in 1955. He grew up in Chicago and went down to Mississippi for the summer to visit his family down in Mississippi. He went on his own. He stayed with I think it's his great uncle and his cousins. And him and his cousins and his friends, they go to a grocery store that is owned by this white couple, Carolyn Bryant and Roy Bryant. And Carolyn Bryant is at the till, and it's kind of speculated as to what Emmett Till, how he interacted with her. I think people say that either he could have like whistled at her, touched her hand, or maybe done really nothing. It's still kind of speculated, and I don't think this book really knows fully what happened. Basically saying it's kind of between Carolyn and Emmett, what truly happened that day. But she became very enraged, told her husband, and I don't know if it was the next day, or a couple of days after, Roy gets his friend J.W. Milam and a couple of other people. They kidnap Emmett Till in the middle of the night, and they take him to this barn right here. And this was on, I think it was J.W. Milam's barn. It was one of their barns on their piece of land. And they proceed to murder or lynch him. And then his body is found in the Tallahatchie River. There was a witness that night, and so there's a trial that happens. It's an all-white jury. The all-white jury finds Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam innocent. They find them innocent, but they do later on confess in Look magazine that they did do the crime, but because of double jeopardy, meaning being tried for the same crime twice, they don't get in trouble for it. Meanwhile, Mammy, his mom, brings Emmett's body back to Chicago, has a public funeral with an open casket so the world can see what happened to Emmett Till. And this becomes a very pivotal moment. Emmett Till becomes an icon of the civil rights movement. I don't know if it becomes a moment that sparks it or influences it, but it's very important to the whole civil rights movement. Yeah, and so this book gets into that murder, but also tells the history of Mississippi, what was like the forces that led to Emmett Till's murder. And Wright Thompson, the author, he actually is connected to this story in a sense because he's from Mississippi. His family farm, he says, is like 23 miles away from the barn where Emmett is killed. And he actually didn't know about that until he had left the state for college, that he knew where Emmett Till was killed. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the book that I really liked. It basically gets into why Wright Thompson wrote this book. If you go through Drew, Weems says, and stop and ask somebody, do you know where Emmett Till was murdered? I think 9 out of 10 people will say, what are you talking about? What does it matter whether there were 2 people or 8 on hand for the torture and murder of a child in Mississippi in 1955? Or whether it took place in Sunflower County or the next county over? I've come to believe these details mean everything. There are many well-known facts about the murder, confirmed by multiple sources over decades, but still there remains a deep vein of mystery. This book is my attempt to go beyond what is known and explore the unknown registers of a killing that, when seen clearly, illuminates the true history of our country. The covering up of Till's murder was not something that was perpetrated by a few bad apples. It couldn't have been. The erasure was a collective effort, one that continues to this day. This isn't comfortable history to face. The more I looked at the story of the barn and came to understand the forces that moved everyone involved in the Mississippi Delta in 1955, the more I understood that the tragedy of humankind isn't that sometimes a few depraved individuals do what the rest of us could never do. It's that the rest of us hide those hateful things from view, never learning the lesson that hate grows stronger and more resistance when it's pushed underground. So basically, he talks about the events of what happened, but it's more about, the history that kind of led to this environment that killed Emmett Till, and also afterwards, the kind of deep suppression of the murder of Emmett Till, this need to suppress this ugliness of Mississippi, to not remember it. And interestingly, he visits the barn more recently, and the owner of the barn is like a dentist who grew up actually around the barn and had no idea that that barn was the barn that Emmett Till was murdered in. So you can see that there is like a deep kind of suppression of the truth around Emmett Till's murder that continues to this day, and this is his way of taking all that ugliness and bringing it to the surface, not just looking at that ugliness, like that murder, that racism, but also the fact that it was suppressed and to this day is still suppressed. I really liked how he talks about the idea of memory, like what is remembered, what is forgotten. He talks about how, white history is remembered in books, and that becomes like true history accounts, but then Black history is remembered in memory. And you can see that with like with the Emmett Till's murder, that there's this need to forget this ugliness. This doesn't represent Mississippi. But then at the same time, there's like this emphasis on memory with like white history, like for instance, the Lost Cause, like the when the South lost the Civil War, never forgetting that or just remembering Mississippi's history. Another thing I really liked or I found interesting was because Emmett Till was from Chicago, he had a different way of life in Chicago than in Mississippi. Like in Mississippi, this is the Jim Crow South. So there are a lot of rules written down, but there are a lot of also unspoken rules and norms. And so he doesn't know that. Emmett Till didn't know that because he's from Chicago. You know, he's existed in this way of life in Chicago, and like it's totally understandable how he interacts maybe with Carolyn Bryant more relaxed, whereas his cousins or their friends is like more uncomfortable and afraid of what Emmett Till did. But also Emmett Till's killing was like a message. A lot of reactionary people from after the murder, you know, when the murder was in the press, talked about how Emmett Till didn't really die. It was some NAACP plot. There was a lot of hatred in the Jim Crow South towards the NAACP, and how Mammy, his mom, was trying to collect insurance money on his death. And they made it like it's like the NAACP versus the state of Mississippi. So this murder wasn't just a big moment for the full civil rights, but it was also this big thing about fighting the NAACP and this Mississippi way of life, this kind of racial code of Jim Crow. So it was very good. I really liked it and I really recommend it. Yeah, that's The Barn. In ninth place, we have Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. This book gets into the relationship between capitalism and slavery. This is actually a really old seminal book. When Eric Williams was a PhD student at Oxford, he wrote his dissertation, and this was actually his dissertation back in 1935. And when it came out, it was super controversial at the time because he was challenging this dominant narrative around not just British historiography, you know, British history, but also like abolition. Yeah, so there are two kind of suppositions that Eric Williams makes that becomes like very controversial at the time. The first one that he made was known among historians. A lot of historians call it the Williams thesis. And then argued that Britain's involvement in the Atlantic slave economy was the primary driving force behind its industrial revolution, and as a result, the foundation of British capitalism in the mid to late 19th century. So that was controversial because it was kind of tying slavery to British capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. I think Western societies tend to do this thing where they split their ugly sides from their more successful parts. So the slavery is this big ugly thing that, you know, the West kind of like was like, oh, that happened and then it ended. But in this case, Eric Williams is like, oh, well, no, actually, the Industrial Revolution happened because of the Atlantic slave trade, because a lot of the kind of wealth and surplus made from the slave trade basically jump-started the Industrial Revolution. So that is pretty controversial because I think they see the Industrial Revolution as just like British genius and intelligence and technological advancement and modernization. But Williams comes in and goes, well, no, actually, this was all accumulation through the slave trade, and through that, Britain was able to build its kind of domestic industrial sector. And this is a generally, like to this day, an accepted thesis. A lot of other scholars agree with this idea that Williams put forth. And then the second supposition that he makes is that the capitalist undercurrents of British slavery ultimately led to its demise as British interests moved toward industrial free trade due to the accumulation of surplus capital from slavery, making slavery itself obsolete in the new industrial era. There was a dominant idea at the time that the slave trade ended, or specifically the British abolished slave trade because it was no longer morally good. They didn't like it. They couldn't stomach it. So it was just like a moral issue. They decided it was wrong and they ended it. And he challenges that notion. He says that, no, actually, slavery ended because of economic reasons, and that there was a shift away from this kind of slave plantation system, which was very, I guess, monopolistic at the time, towards like a free trade environment, which kind of led to the decline of slavery. And he also says that slavery became unprofitable, therefore they abandoned it. Now, this supposition is actually criticized a lot to this day. A lot of scholars critique it, specifically the idea that slavery is unprofitable. A lot of scholars say that slavery was actually profitable and that there were other reasons for abolition. So I view this book, this is a very seminal book, but I view it as like a starting point for slavery. I think I would like to read a lot more about slavery. I know a lot of authors jump off from this, so I'm glad I read it, and I think it's a really good read. I mean, what's interesting is it was so controversial at the time that nobody wanted to. So he was trying to publish this as a book, his thesis, and nobody wanted to publish it. There was even this guy who was like known for publishing radical books. He wouldn't even want to touch it because of how challenged the dominant British narrative and how it made the British history look bad. So it's interesting because he wrote this thesis in 1935. He did put some excerpts out in 1939, but it wasn't published until 1944. So it did take a while for him to publish it. And even then, big publishers weren't publishing it. What's also interesting is Eric Williams actually goes off, and he's from Trinidad and Tobago, and he becomes first prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago when it gets its independence from the British. I think it's from the British. Yeah, and I think they call him the father of the nation. So that is very interesting. Yeah, I really liked it. I mean, there were parts where I was like, I don't know if I agree with this. I think that's why it's a little bit lower on my list. But like in general, it's a really good book, and I think it's a good starting point if you want to read about slavery and capitalism, how they interact with each other. Yeah, that's that. Okay, we have in 7th place. Nope, 8th place. Another controversial book. Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil by Hannah Arendt. So basically, Hannah Arendt, who is a German Jewish woman, she actually fled Germany. I don't remember when, but she did flee Germany because of Nazi rule in Germany. She fled, and then she went to France, but then France, becomes occupied by Nazi Germany. So she flees France, goes to America. Yeah, so she's in America. So there's this trial that's going to happen. This is after, obviously, this is in the 60s, I believe. I think this is happening in the 60s. That there's this trial of this German Nazi leader, Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible for the deportation. I think he was the architect of the deportation of Jews throughout German occupied Europe. So he was behind the logistics of deporting Jews from Germany to the east and all other areas towards the east to concentration camps. So he's pretty big. So the trial around him, that which was taking place in Jerusalem, was really huge, and she wanted to report on this trial. So she tells the New Yorker, who she was writing for, that she wanted to cover this trial, and they agree. So she goes to Jerusalem to report on this trial. This becomes deeply personal for her because I think she really wants to unpack like what happened with Nazi Germany. Her previous book before this one was The Origin of Totalitarianism, which she had done like a lot of research on Nazi Germany. So I think she wanted to kind of see this Nazi German leader in person, see what he was like, just kind of understand what happened. Basically, what she finds is the main thesis of this book is the banality of evil, which is in the subtitle, is that he's not a monster, which was obviously the dominant, thinking at the time, which is like understandable. That they were like, the Nazis are these monster, pure evil demons, otherworldly. But then when she sees Eichmann, she just realizes he's so painfully normal, so regular, just not just like because of like not just looking at his history, but also looking at the way he talks, the way he acts on the stand. Like, he's just so normal to her. And so that's kind of essentially what she says, and that becomes actually pretty controversial because a lot of people perceive her as like empathizing with Eichmann or humanizing him. It was so controversial that I think at one point she even wanted to like abandon the banality of evil, that title. I don't know if she got to choose the title. I don't know, but it's like mentioned at the very end or something. It's not even like her. She doesn't even use that word a lot. She just says it at the very, that's saying a lot. She uses it at the very end. But it is like the main point, I think, of her what she's saying is like this pure evil is so painfully normal. He's so regular. He's not some otherworldly monster. So I wrote down, it says that she was interested in understanding Eichmann's mind and to explore the totality of the moral collapse the Nazis caused in respectable European society. Yeah, so that's what she kind of wanted to explore when she was reporting on the trial. And it was intensely personal work, the delayed cure of a pain that weighed upon her as a Jew, a former Zionist, and a former German. Yeah, so I think one of the best excerpts from this book says, and this is like how Arendt thinks, is evil as she saw it need not be committed only by demonic monsters, but with disastrous effect by morons and imbeciles as well, especially if, as we see in our own day, their deeds are sanctioned by religious authority. Also, evil comes from a failure to think. It defies thought, for as soon as thought tries to engage itself with evil and examine the premises and principles from which it originates, it is frustrated because it finds nothing there. That is the banality of evil. One of the, I think, best articles I found about what Arendt meant by banality of evil, just because it's so it was so controversial. I don't know if it's as controversial now as it was back in the 60s, but Judith Butler gives a really good article. If a crime against humanity had become, in some sense, banal, it was precisely because it was committed in a daily way, systematically, without being adequately named and opposed. By calling a crime against humanity banal, she was trying to point to the way in which the crime had become, for the criminals, accepted, routinized, and implemented without moral revulsion and political indignation and resistance. What had become banal and astonishing so was the failure to think. I think that is just really, I think that makes a lot of sense actually for me personally after reading the book, because it's about Eichmann is seen as this kind of man who just follows orders, and doesn't really think about the consequences of those orders, or what's he really doing, like the crimes he's committing. And I think that's really powerful because I think it's scarily true. I feel like even today you kind of see, you can see it of like someone just following orders, just doing what they're told versus really examining what they're doing. And I think, she brings up a good point in the book about how, what happens if like within Nazi Germany, for instance, the laws that were passed were immoral, but to break them is to go against the law. Illegal, right? But then you're doing the moral thing. It's so powerful book because I feel like it makes you like think a lot about, our idea of evil. I just think our idea of evil being super inhumane is a little fanciful. And she truly kind of reveals it, what it actually really is. And I feel like if you read a book like this, you can better understand that, and better understand like your participation. There was another point she was making in the book. The trial was held in Jerusalem, in Israel, and she was very critical of the trial itself. One, because she thought it was a show trial, that Ben-Gurion was using the trial as a kind of way of bringing together national identity. And two, because this was a trial that was like, one, it was a trial specifically for a crime against the Jews, which I don't think she didn't want it to be a trial for the crime against the Jews. She wanted it to be a trial for the crimes against humanity, because there were other victims like, gypsies, gay people, homeless, mentally ill. So there were a lot of victims, and she wants to look at it wholly in its entirety. And another thing is, because it was a crime against the Jews, it was like they were trying Eichmann for all of Nazi Germany. And she didn't like that. She wanted him to be tried for the crimes that he committed himself, but not for all of Nazi Germany. And so I think Judith Butler mentions this about how there's this paradox by making like Eichmann like this uniquely pathological evil individual, but also representing all Nazis. It's like he's either one or the other, but he becomes like that within this trial. And I think she prefers like she just talks about how there needs to be a more international legal framework to deal with this crime against humanity. Like this is a kind of for her, an unprecedented crime, and it cannot be tried within any nation state. It just wouldn't work within any national laws. Like it has to be tried on an international basis, but it also needs like new like legal laws to be created to kind of challenge this or take on this new crime. So that was like her criticism around that, and I think she did get flack for like being critical of Israel. So yeah, those are like the main things she talks about. I really, really recommend this book. It's so powerful. I think it really sticks with you and it really kind of reshapes the way you see evil. And I think everyone should like learn that, whether it's a Nazi or something else, like another evil. I think it's just like a good framework to bear in mind. I think she really gets you to think, to kind of stop and chew on these things. So yeah, that is that. So in 7th place, we have Women, Race, and Class by Angela Y. Davis. This is just basically a set of essays, I believe, about women, race, and class. This was published in the 80s, I believe, but it was one of the, I read somewhere that it was one of the first books to kind of talk about the intersection between women, race, and class, which makes it a seminal piece of work. If you look at anybody who is kind of leftist, radical, this is one of the books that gets recommended a lot. So it's very important. And so I was like, I need to read this book. And it didn't disappoint. Yeah, Angela Davis is like character in herself. Like she was part of the second wave of the feminist movement. She was also part of the Black Panther Party and the Communist Party. So she has a little bit of a radical. She's like part radical, part academic. Yeah, so this is not, I think this is her third book she wrote. And she talks about a lot of different topics in here. Like it says here, ranging from the age of slavery to contemporary injustices, this seminal history of race, gender, and class inequality offers an alternative view of female struggles for liberation. There was a lot of good things in here, things that I learned about, like the relationship between like white women and black men, for instance, like how the feminist movement or the women's movement was like very middle class white women, and they saw their struggle as like very well. A lot of them were quite pretty racist, and there was this kind of I don't know, like a battle between black men and white women in the sense that women saw their enfranchisement as like more important, like they saw it through a more gendered lens, whereas black men had to deal with race, and that put black women in interesting position as they are both black and both women. Frederick Douglass himself said, like, I think he said something about how like the black people won't be free until the black man gets a vote. It's very interesting how the women's movement saw like women's enfranchisement as more important, but then black men weren't better off than white women. Also, she gets into the lynchings of the, what is it, the 1920s? Around the 1920s, I believe, with the rise of the Klan, there was like a lot of lynchings of black men, and a lot of the crimes that they were being accused of was like raping white women, assaulting white women, and also like she talks about white working class women versus white middle class women, and how white working class women more allied toward the abolitionist struggle. It's just fascinating. I think everyone should read it. This is a very important, I think, intersectional conversations. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I really liked it. And I'm going to read another book by her. So that's that. In sixth place, we have The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World by Anthony Lowenstein. This book gets basically into how Israel uses Palestine and Palestinians as like a laboratory to practice its technology on, and then will go and export that technology and sell it as battle tested. I think this is the first book to kind of tackle this idea, and Greg Grandin, who wrote in his book Empire's Workshop, I haven't read that one, but I would love to. He wrote about how Washington, like America, would use Latin America as its testing ground. So Anthony jumps off that and says that Israel uses the Palestinians as its testing ground. Yeah, so this book focuses on the potency of Palestine as a laboratory for methods of control and separation of populations, how Israel has exposed the occupation and why it's such an attractive model. He gets into the idea of how the occupation itself is like a marketing tool, and how other ethno-nationalist states who desire occupying or controlling their populations look to Israel, and how Israel exports that technology and that model to those other nations. And he gets into, I was actually surprised that Israel has given a lot of weapons and training to terrible dictatorships. Like, one example is Pinochet. So Chile had a democratically elected president, Salvador Allende. There was a CIA-backed coup, and Pinochet was put in place, and he killed a lot of Chileans. He killed a lot of people. And Israel worked with him. What's interesting is Lowenstein talks about how Israel has this history of military in the sense that it got a lot of the money it got from Germany in terms of like reparations, and from France was invested in the military. Also, they were trained by the British military. So there is that early military history. As early as the 1950s, Israel was exporting weapons. But then he mentions how after 1967 and the Six-Day War, militarism becomes its guiding principle. And I think you see it till this day. It's like a highly militaristic state. And also after 1967, Israel kind of situates itself within American imperialism. Like it becomes essentially a partner in the American Cold War and aiding in American imperialism. So you see that with Pinochet in Chile. You also see that with the Shah of Iran and the Contras, which was a huge scandal for the US. They supported the Contras in Nicaragua. They also, crazily, they supported South Africa. Israel had a great relationship with South Africa. Apartheid South Africa. So, yeah, there's just a lot of good stuff in here. Anthony Lowenstein, he's a Jewish Australian journalist. He's really good. Actually, this book is so popular right now. He's made a podcast. So if you don't want to read it, but I still think it should be read, he made a podcast. And on top of that, now he has a documentary on this book. So if you want to consume all three, you can. But if you don't want to read it, there's also the podcast and the documentary. But I really, really recommend this book. It is very scary, but everyone should read it. So we are now in the top five, my top 5 favorite books. So in 5th place we have Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial by Sara McDeesey. Okay, this book is so hard to explain. I will try my best. I think Sara is kind of fascinated with this idea of like, specifically within the liberal establishment, which views itself as like pro LGBTQ rights, taking care of nature, peace and empathy, and down with racism. These are liberals, right? They think this way. So he's kind of fascinated how there's a lot of liberals who defend Israel, and it's like genocide and apartheid system. And so he's just kind of like, how does that work? How do people who have these ideas, these moral values, how is it they look at Israel and they are like totally fine with what's going on? There's just something going on. And so he goes off of this person named Stanley Cohen who talks about states of denial, how people will use ignorance or denial to not face reality. But he goes one step further and he talks about how people deny the denial. Basically, you can deny Palestinians exist, but what he's saying is you're actually denying that you're even denying that Palestinians exist. And a lot of times he says you do that through affirmation. So by affirming something good, you deny that you're even denying something. So I'll get into like some of the examples he talks about, and I think it'll make more sense. So I'm just going to read this part in the book where he talks about affirmation as denial. It is difficult to square your support for principles of inclusivity and tolerance with your support for a state founded on the premise of exclusion and intolerance. But ignoring, looking aside, refusing to recognize, these are difficult to sustain on their own and provide no basis for the construction of a liberal and ethical sense of self. What is needed, in addition, is a set of values to affirm in a positive sense, or better yet, a set of values to affirm the very affirmation of which transacts denial, in such a way that the act of denial is doubly or even triply invisible. First, because you deny it. Second, because your act of denial is so sweeping and comprehensive that it is itself denied. And finally, because the act of affirming some other value is so hyperbolic, so loudly exaggerated, so theatrically overstated and overperformed, that it completely occludes the act of denial that it simultaneously expresses. Just to like make it make more sense, by looking at the different scenarios in which he looks at this idea of affirmation as denial. For instance, he looks at the transformation of the landscape of Palestine in the aftermath of the ethnic cleansing of 1948. So, with the Nakba in 1948 or 1947, there were a lot of demolished, abandoned villages. And these villages are covered up by forests. So, there's this idea of greening the landscape where they like plant pine, I think it's pine forests. Yeah, I think it's like the Jewish National Fund has these like, I think these boxes where you can put like you could donate money to planting a tree in Israel, and a lot of these forests cover Palestinian villages that were destroyed or abandoned. And so he says how greening the landscape, so the planting of forests is the affirmation, it's the positive value, but that denies the destruction of villages, which is the denial of the Palestinians even being on that land. So these villages become images that Palestinians had lived there and that there had been expulsion of Palestinians from the land. And so the trees kind of act as a covering of that. For one, it's like covering that there was expulsion of Palestinians. But at the same time, it's like, oh, you're planting trees and trees are good for the environment. That's a good thing. So I hope that kind of makes more sense. The other example he looks at is Israel is the only democratic state in the Middle East. So democracy becomes the affirmation, the positive value, and the apartheid system is being denied. So, yeah. So it's like, how could you not support a democratic state? How could you not? I would support any democratic state. But underneath it, it denies that an apartheid system is happening. The third example he gets into is Israel emerging as the global icon of gay rights, Tel Aviv like becoming this gay rights city, and how gay rights becomes the affirmation, the positive value, and then the suppression of Palestinian rights becomes what is denied. Yeah, so he mentions how, there was times when more gay people and women were getting more and more rights in Israel. At the same time, Palestinians were losing rights. But then you look at it as a liberal and you're like, well, I support gay rights. I support this democracy that, supports gay rights. And so you don't have to look at what's underneath, which is the fact that Palestinians are being denied their rights. And then the last thing is the Museum of Tolerance in Jerusalem. So there's a Museum of Tolerance in LA, and they were opening one in Jerusalem, but it was being built on a Muslim cemetery. And they still built it anyways, even though there was a lot of pushback. This museum talks about tolerance. So the irony of this museum talking about tolerance as it's built over a Muslim graveyard. That becomes kind of the main, that's why it's called Tolerance is a Wasteland. Yeah, that's like the main, I think, crux too of the story is the Museum of Tolerance in Jerusalem. And so tolerance becomes the affirmation, right? Tolerance is good. We don't hate tolerance. But then Palestinian claim to a cemetery space becomes denied. So hopefully that makes sense. So it is through this denial, but not just the denial itself, it's the affirming of something good that allows Israel to kind of be acceptable in liberal spaces where they value more human rights and things like that. I just thought that was so good, so important. One of the things I really liked that he mentions in here too is this idea of like repetition. Repetition makes the imaginary real. Belief in Israel as a democracy repeated as constant affirmation. The sheer repetition is necessary to sustain the belief being expressed. So I feel like you see that in this affirmation as denial is also repetition by repeating Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Then you start believing it, even though it isn't a democracy. There's an apartheid system. So yeah, it just shows the tools that are being used, the techniques that are being used to kind of allow what's happening to Palestinians continue to happen. And why those who support like rights, human rights all over the world have this contradiction when it comes to Palestine. I also forgot to mention that Sari McDeasy comes from a very academic family. His like a lot of people in his family are academic, but he's actually the nephew of Edward Said, so that's cool. And him and his brother have a channel on YouTube called McDeasy Street. I don't know if it's a podcast, but so yeah. Sorry, McDeasy. Very good. Very good. Okay, we're going to change it up. In fourth place, we have Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. It's a fiction book. I'm different. I changed it up. So this book is translated from Arabic into English in 2020. So actually pretty recently. A little fun fact about this book. It was translated in German in like 2022. Was going to receive an award in 2023 in Germany, but then a German journalist, I think, said it was like anti-Semitic, so the organization that had the ceremony postponed it, and there was like so much controversy around them postponing it. So this book is split into two parts, but it's mainly around this historical account, so a real account of this Bedouin girl who, how come Zionist forces raped and then murdered. Very gruesome story. So the first part of the book follows one of these soldiers, these Zionist soldiers. This is in 1949, so the state of Israel has been created, and I think these soldiers were demarcating their, borders, but also maintaining like the borders of like this is Israel. And so they're in the Negev desert on duty, and they happen upon this Bedouin family and kill them. And the soldiers like quite sociopathic. I don't know. The second part is following a Palestinian woman who's in Ramallah in the West Bank, and she finds out about this story that happened in the first part, this account in a newspaper brief. And the day that the Bedouin girl's murdered is the day that she was born, the Palestinian woman. Yeah, 25 years to the day before she was born. And so she becomes like fixated on this story, and she wants to know like the truth of it and what happened. Through her, you kind of see how the apartheid system prevents her from being able to like find out what happened. I wanted to read this little excerpt from it. I really liked it. A group of soldiers capture a girl, rape her, then kill her 25 years to the day before I was born. This minor detail, which others might not give a second thought, will stay with me forever in spite of myself and how hard I try to forget it. The truth of it will never stop chasing me, given how fragile I am, as weak as the trees out there past the window pane. There may in fact be nothing more important than this little detail, if one wants to arrive at the complete truth, which, by leaving out the girl's story, the article does not reveal. So yeah, I think that's kind of where the title comes from, but there's also like, you could also like say it means other things, but about her fixating on this like minor detail, this little news story. I really like how it talks about like memory and time, how like almost like there's no sense of what is past and what is present. Like they exist in a constant past. The past is always happening as the present. And I think, she does like a good job of kind of showing that in this book. I really liked her idea of space, about how in the Palestinian woman's story, she's super restricted where she can go because of the apartheid system. But then in the first part with the soldier, he is moving freely, and if they see someone in their line of vision who isn't Israeli or whatever, they kill them. Really like that idea. And then this kind of passing down of like trauma from the Bedouin girl down to her. Yeah, I really, really liked it. I'm not like a big fiction reader, so I feel like when I like it, it's good. I recommend everybody read it, and it's so fast. It's so thin. Like, it's so fast. You can finish it very quickly. In third place, we have, I loved her. Palestine Hijacked, How Zionism Forged an Apartheid State from River to Sea by Thomas Suarez. Wow. So she's a chunky book. She's chunky. But for some reason, I just flew by it. It was very good. Ilan Pape said, This is the first comprehensive and structured analysis of the violence and terror employed by the Zionist movement and later the state of Israel against the people of Palestine. Yeah, so it is like a first of its kind in that it traces Zionist terrorism leading up to the partition, the UN partition. First, Palestine was under British colonialism, so it was the British mandate, and there was Zionist terrorism kind of pushed the British to like capitulate to their demands and like give them a state and then basically get the hell out. He does like a really good job of really getting into that history. It's very in-depth research. He uses a lot of primary resources. I think he went to declassified British documents, so he went to Britain to get that, and then he went and got information from like Ilan Pape and Benny Morris, who are like Israeli historians, and he also looks at American documents. So there's definitely a lot of primary sources in here. So he did his research. He talks about how there was like Palestinian terror in the 1920s, 30s, and 30s, but that was because they had experienced a lot of discrimination under British colonialism, and they tried like other forms of resistance, like strikes and protests and just other non-violent forms, but then those prove futile, so you start seeing like more violent forms coming from that. Then he mentions how that level of violence was dealt with extreme violence from the British, like hangings and using Palestinians as human shields and like demolishing homes. So it was met with a lot of British force. But then he talks about how there was a lot of Zionist violence in the like 40s and how the British kind of capitulated or didn't really do anything about that violence. And that kind of allowed this kind of terrorism to push for partition, which gave Israel a state. He also talks about how Zionists like Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, who just wanted all of it, did not just want part of it. And so they used this partition to spearhead kind of grabbing up more land. I really like how he talks about this kind of myth of cycle of violence between the Palestinians and the Israelis, so I'm going to read that. By framing the dispute in terms of Israel versus the Palestinians and 1967 borders versus settlements, we are led to envision some sort of political squabble, an endlessly complicated border dispute, which the Palestinians are endlessly unwilling to settle. This misdiagnosis nurtures another myth, the idea of a cycle of violence. The violence in Israel-Palestine is linear, not cyclical. Israel's territorial expansion and ethnic cleansing are the forward violence, not the result of a cycle, and continue no matter what the Palestinians do in response to it. Yeah, I really like this book. This is like, I feel like a must read if you want to read about Palestine. Definite read. Yeah. In second place, we have The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America by Greg Grandin. So I did actually mention Greg Grandin before because in Palestine Laboratory, I told you how he kind of went off of Greg Grandin's book. Not this one, but another one. So this book is about the myth of the frontier, how it's so seminal to kind of American identity. And then he gets into like the history of the way the frontier was kind of viewed throughout American history, like starting, I think, just like at the American Revolution, all the way up till Trump's election in 2016. And he talks about how there's this like myth of the frontier, but then when it comes to Trump's presidency and the border wall, there's this kind of closing off of the frontier, this like end of this myth and this kind of new myth of the border wall. So this book goes off of the Frontier Thesis by Frederick Jackson Turner, which argued that the expansion of settlement across a frontier of free land created a uniquely American form of political equality, of vibrant, forward-looking individualism. Grandin says how the frontier served as a diagnosis and prescription, and when the physical frontier was closed, its imagery could easily be applied to other arenas of expansion, to markets, war, culture, technology, science, the psyche, and politics. But with the election of Donald Trump and border wall represented the end of the frontier, the end of the myth. What distinguishes earlier racist presidents like Jackson and Wilson from Trump, though, is that they were in office during the upswing of America's moving out in the world, when domestic political polarization could be stanched, and the country held together, even after the Civil War nearly tore it apart. But the promise of endless growth, Trumpism, is extremism turned inward, all-consuming and self-devouring. There is no divine messianic crusade that can harness and redirect passions outward. Expansion in any form can no longer satisfy the interest, reconcile the contradictions, dilute the factions, or redirect the anger. So, yeah, he talks about how this frontier, one, it's become so central to the American identity of this idea of going forward and finding yourself and this rugged individualism. Like, this is a myth that has carried the American identity for so long, manifest destiny. But then there becomes like an abandoning with Trump's era, closing off this frontier. He talks about how the frontier becomes the safety valve where any kind of problems happening, any tensions, divisions could just be diffused by like people moving west, not into this like pressure cooker of a place. And so once you kind of close that off, you abandon that sort of outlet for, everything, like racism, classism, all these things can no longer be diffused outward and are now contained inward. Here he talks about the new myth of the frontier wall. It's America's new myth, a monument to the final closing of the frontier. It is a symbol of a nation that used to believe that it had escaped history, or at least strode atop history, but now finds itself trapped by history, and of a people who used to think they were captains of the future, but now are prisoners of the past. It was such an interesting book. It was so good. Such a very interesting perspective. So I know I like a book when it makes me want to read other books. That's how I know I like a book, or just like other subjects. It makes me so much more interested in other things. Like now all of a sudden I want to read about the Vietnam War. Now all of a sudden I want to read about the Mexican War or the Spanish Wars. I want to read about the frontier, settler colonialism. There's so much I want to read about. And so this book is just such a good book. Definitely recommend. Everyone needs to read. It's just such a good perspective on Trump. I feel like there's a lot of books out there about Trump, but it's hard to find a good quality take on Trump. But I feel like this is a really good one. Okay, last one. Number one. Let's do the number one dance because it's number one. Because it's number one is my favorite book of the year, and honestly, I think it's like a favorite book. Not the favorite book, but a favorite book in all of my reading. So that's saying something. So in first place, we have White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea by Tyler Stovall. Wow. This book changed me. So what is white freedom? And the author actually defines it. He says, it's the belief and practice that freedom is central to white racial identity and that only white people can or should be free. So that's kind of the point he's making in this entire book, is that there's this thing called white freedom and it's only for white people. And he looks specifically at two kind of seminal modern ideas, which is race and freedom, around the Enlightenment era. Actually, he talks about how there becomes more emphasis around the idea of freedom in the Enlightenment era, and a lot of our ideas of freedom are codified in the Enlightenment era. So the freedom is very important during this era, but at the same time, during this era is the Atlantic slave trade. So like, how can we talk about freedom while slavery is booming? So he looks at Europe, so that was Europe, and then he looks at America also, which is like, its whole foundation is built on freedom, and yet it is built on native genocide, the enslavement of black people, the systemic racial discrimination. So how can these like places be talking about freedom at the same time that these people have slaves? I mean, a lot of the framers, I think, of the Constitution had slaves, and they talk about freedom. So he's looking at freedom and race. So the relationship between freedom and race has been viewed in paradoxical terms. But this book challenges this view, suggesting instead the relationship between liberty and racism is not necessarily contradictory, but rather has its own internal consistency. In short, the author rejects the idea of a paradoxical relationship between the two and sees that there is no contradiction. Ideas of freedom in the modern world have been racialized. In particular, many have considered whiteness and white racial identity intrinsic to modern liberty. To be free is to be white, and to be white is to be free. He says here freedom can be and is historically has been a racist ideology. So white freedom thus challenges the idea that freedom and race are necessarily opposites, arguing instead that both historically and in the present day they have worked together to construct white identity. So that's what he's arguing in this book. And I think he does a great job. I don't know. I'm not like a scholar, but I really feel like it made so much sense. And he like looks at this relationship throughout different scenarios, the relationship between race and freedom. One of the things he talks about is like black freedom, how black freedom is viewed negatively, like specifically around the Haitian Revolution and how that was seen as very violent. A lot of white people were fearful of slave revolts with their own slaves. Black freedom, as they're like sculpting this idea of white freedom, black freedom becomes this negative thing that's not good. So it could just show you how, like, as they're building this idea of freedom, what black freedom is not what white freedom is. They're very different. Another thing he talks about I really found was interesting was this thing he calls savage freedom. And he specifically looks at childhood and piracy as being almost like too free. There's like this specifically Victorian ideas of like what it means to be like a civilized citizen, and children and pirates don't fit into that framework. They're kind of like savages, and they essentially like racialize them, like calling children savages, like identifying them as savages. They need to be like tamed, civilized to become men or like women of Victorian era. And then like pirates are racialized. One, the Barbary pirates, which were Mediterranean pirates, I don't know, Middle Eastern pirates, who took white slaves, so that they definitely did not like that. And then like even the golden age of piracy, Caribbean pirates, there was a lot of apparently there's a lot of escaped slaves who became pirates, and even the white slaves white pirates become like racialized. So it just shows you how anything that didn't fit into their framework of white freedom becomes like racialized. And so that's how they kind of sculpt white freedom. He even talks about Germany and how Germans became like racialized, like they would depict them in a racial other way, like they weren't white. There's just so much good stuff in here. So much good stuff. Like, I talk about this book the most. I like will read books and be like, oh my god, this is white freedom. So it's really shifted my brain chemistry and just shifted the way I look at the world. And I know a book is so good when it does that. And then there's a lot of books, that I'm now interested in because of reading this. So she's in the number one spot. She's the best. I love her. And I recommend to everybody. Everyone has to learn it. Everyone has to read this book. Oh, it's literally shortlisted for the Kundal History Prize in McGill University. One of NPR's books we love. So that's like something. Anyways, that is my favorite. So that's it. That's it. So those are my favorite books, my top 10 favorite books of 2024. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got some recommended books out of it or anything like that, or recommendations. Yeah, I hope you liked this video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to me chat about books I love, because I could chat forever. But that's everything.